Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to our read aloud of Mr. Scarborough's Family by Anthony Trollope, a late novel of his, and the last really good novel that he wrote. That was so late that he wrote it serialized for a serialized audience, and he was dead before it came out in book form. That it crossed the transit for him, and this is the story of the eponymous Mr. Scarborough, who has disinherited his eldest son Montjoy by declaring to the world that he is actually illegitimate. Because Montjoy who is such an inveterate gambler, has raised so many debts against Mr. Scarborough's estate of Tretton Park that the whole estate would go to his creditors if something weren't done. So he has set that scandal upon the world, and Montjoy has fled London. But Montjoy didn't flee London under neutral circumstances. He was told by his father, well, you're not the heir, you never were, you're illegitimate. He didn't believe it, but it made him furious. He got drunk, he gambled, and at 2 a.m, he met young Harry Annesley, who was a friend of his at school and also a rival of his, in fact, a victor for the hand of Florence Montjoy, his first cousin, who Montjoy was thinking that he would just marry, just in the course of things, that it would keep their families together. But she loves Harry. And Montjoy learns this, and when they meet at 2 a.m, both probably a little worse for wear and for liquor, they come to blows. And Harry strikes Montjoy down to the pavement and walks away, not knowing whether he's alive or dead, not knowing if he's seriously injured or not. And it turns out that the next day, no one has found him there. He's disappeared. And it's the talk of London. Harry Annesley can't stop talking about it himself. He can't stop asking people. He doesn't go straight to the police and tell them, I saw him. I was obviously the last person to see him alive. Because he's worried or doesn't think that he deserves, that he needs to. He does go to Florence and tell her what happened. But he doesn't tell anybody else. But word starts to get around. The London police start to wonder, why is this kid asking so many questions about the disappearance of this captain? But it doesn't matter to Harry, because at a party, he confesses his feelings to Florence, and she reciprocates them, not only by squeezing his arm, but by calling him her hero. When last we saw him, he's walking out of that party so ecstatic that he throws his hat in the air. And then the novel moved away from him. It shifted away from that whole story. We go to Monte Carlo and find out that Captain Scarborough is alive. He's still gambling. We go down to Tretton Park to rehearse the inner workings of what's going on down there, not only in terms of Mr. Scarborough's plan to make his second son, Augustus, his heir, but also their plans to pay off the creditors with a fraction of what they owe, of what they're owed. So it's about time that we return to Harry Annesley, and that's what we do. That's what we do in this chapter. This is chapter 22, called Harry Annesley is Summoned Home. Just now I am triumphant, Harry Annesley had said to his hostess as he left Mrs. Armitage's house in the Paragon in Cheltenham. He was absolutely triumphant, throwing his hat up into the air in an abandonment of his joy, for he was not a man to have conceived so well of his own parts, to have flattered himself with the girl he must certainly be his. In other words, he wasn't sure that she would say yes, that she would have him. And that when mentioning that kind of a man, well, old man Tony has to come forward and grouse for a while, so button up. There are at present a number of young men who think that that few girls are worth the winning, but that any girl is to be had, not by asking, which would be too troublesome, but by simply looking at her. You can see the feelings in their faces. They are for the most part small in stature, well-made little men who are aware that they have something to be proud of, wearing close-packed, shining little hats, by which they seem to add more than a cubit to their stature. Men endowed with a certain gifts of personal dignity, I may perhaps call it, though the word rises somewhat too high. They look as though they were about to say such a clever thing, but their spoken thoughts seldom rise above acrid sharpness. They respect no one, above all not their elders. To such a one, his horse comes first, if he have a horse, then a dog, then a stick, and after that the mistress of his affections. But their fault is not altogether of their own making. It is the girls themselves who spoil them and endure their inanity because of that assumed look of superiority, which to the eyes of the outside world would be a little offensive were it not a little foolish. But they do not marry often. Whether it be that the girls know better at last, or that they themselves do not see sufficiently clearly their future dinners, who can say? They are for the most part younger brothers, or perhaps have discovered the best ways of getting out of the world whatever scraps the world can afford them. All these years later, and Tony is still upset at being the awkward, ugly kid at school. Harry Annesley's faults were altogether of another kind. In regard to this young woman, the Florence whom he had loved, he had been over-modest. Now his feelings of glory were altogether redundant. Having been told by Florence that she was devoted to him, he walked with his head among the heavens. The first instinct with such a young man as those of whom I have spoken teaches him, the moment he has committed himself, to begin to consider how he can get out of the scrape. It is not much of a scrape, for when an older man comes this way, a man verging towards baldness, with a good professional income, our little friend is forgotten, and he is passed by without a word. But Harry now had a conviction, on that one special night, that he would never be forgotten and never would forget. He was filled at once with an unwonted pride. All the world was now at his feet, and all the stars were open to him. He had begun to have a glimmering of what it was that Augustus Scarborough intended to do. Augustus Scarborough is intending to ruin him. We were told in the last chapter that he already is ruined. But the intentions of Augustus Scarborough were now of no moment to him. He was clothed in a panoply of armor which would be true against all weapons. At any rate, on that night and during the next day, this feeling remained the same with him. But life has some buffets in store for him. Then he received a summons from his mother at Buston, that is, the family estate down in the country, where his uncle, Uncle Prosper, rules, and Harry is his heir. His mother pressed him to come at once down to the parsonage. Harry's father is the parson. Your uncle has been with your father and has said terrible things about you. As you know, my brother is not very strong-minded, and I should not care so much for what he says were not so much in his hands. I cannot understand what it is all about, but your father says that he does nothing but threaten. He talks of putting the entail to one side. Entails used to be fixed things, I thought, but since what old Mr. Scarborough did, nobody seems to regard them now. So Uncle Prosper's property is entailed to Harry. But the whole world now knows that entails don't mean anything because of what Mr. Scarborough has done. A very interesting interaction of these two storylines. But even suppose the entail does remain, what are you to do about the income? Your father thinks you had better come down and have a little talk about the matter. The income being an allowance that Harry has made by his uncle. If Harry didn't have that, he would have only his stipend to go on, which is, he would not be able to live normally. He'd be a pauper. This was the first blow received since the moment of his exaltation. Harry knew very well that the entail was fixed and could not be put aside by Mr. Prosper, though Mr. Scarborough might have succeeded with his entail. But yet he was aware that his present income was chiefly dependent on his uncle's goodwill. It's not a lot of money. His uncle is being cheap, but it's still more than nothing. To be reduced to live on his fellowship would be very dreadful. And that income, such as it was, depended entirely on his celibacy. And he had too, as he was well aware, engendered habits of idleness during the last 2 years. The mind of a young man so circumstanced turns always first to the bar and then to literature. At the bar he did not think that there could be any opening for him. In the first place, it was late to begin, and then he was humble enough to believe of himself that he had none of the peculiar gifts necessary for a judge or even an advocate. No, you don't. You could be a clerk. I don't know. I don't know that I'm cut out for the law. I don't think I'd make a good judge. Perhaps the knowledge that 6 or 7 years preliminary labor would be necessary was a deterrent. The rewards of literature might be achieved immediately. Don't go hoping on that. Such was his idea. But he had another idea, perhaps as erroneous, that this career would not become a gentleman who intended to be a squire of Buston. He had seen 2 or 3 men, decidedly bohemian in their modes of life, to whom he did not wish to assimilate himself. There was Quaverdale, whom he had known intimately at St. John's, and there was also and who was on the press. Quaverdale had quarreled absolutely with his father, who was also a clergyman, and having been thrown altogether on his own resources, had come out as a writer for The Coming Hour. That's a periodical called The Coming Hour. He made his 500 or 600 a year in a rattling, loose, uncertain sort of fashion, and was, so thought Harry Annesley, the dirtiest man of his acquaintance. Yay, freelancers! He did not believe in the 600 a year. Or Quaverdale would certainly have changed his shirt more frequently, and would sometimes have had a new pair of trousers. He was very amusing, very happy, very thoughtless, and as a rule altogether impecunious. Annesley had never known him without the means of getting a good dinner, but those means did not rise to the purchase of a new hat. Putting Quaverdale before him as an example, Annesley could not bring himself to choose literature as a profession. Thinking of all this when he received his mother's letter, he assured himself that Florence would not like a professional literature. He wrote to say that he would be down at Buston in 5 days' time. It does not become a son who is the fellow of a college and the heir of a property to obey his parents too quickly. But he gave up the intermediate days to thinking over the condition which bound him to his uncle, and to discussing the prospect with Quaverdale, who, as usual, was remaining in town to do the editor's work of the coming hour. If he interfered with me, I should tell him to go to bed, said Quaverdale. The allusion was, of course, to Mr. Prosper. I am not on those sorts of terms with him. I should make my own terms, and then let him do his worst. What can he do? If he means to withdraw his beggarly £250, of course he'll do it. I suppose I do owe him something in the way of respect. Not if he threatens you in regard to money. What does it come to? That you are to cringe at his heels for a beggarly allowance which he has been pleased to bestow on you without your asking? Very well, my dear fellow, I should say to him, you can stop at the moment, if you please. For certain objects of your own, that your heir might live in the world after a certain fashion, you have bestowed it. It has been mine since I was a child. If you can reconcile it to your conscience to discontinue it, do so. You would find that he would have to think twice about it. He will stop it, and what am I to do then? Can I get an opening at any of these papers? Quaverdale whistled, a mode of receiving the overture which was not pleasing to Annesley. I don't suppose that anything very, very superhuman in the way of intellect is required. Annesley had got a fellowship, whereas Quaverdale had done nothing at university. Couldn't you make a pair of shoes? Shoemakers do get good wages. What do you mean? A fellow never can get you to be serious for 2 minutes together. I was never more serious in my life. That I am to make shoes? Well, I don't quite mean that. I don't suppose you can make them. You have to learn the trade first and show that you are adept. And must I show that I am adept before I can write for the coming hour? There was a tone of sarcasm which was not lost on Quaverdale. Certainly you must, and that you are a better adept than I, who have got the place of some other unfortunate who will have to be put out of his berth. The coming hour only requires a certain number. Of course, there are many newspapers in London, and many magazines, and much literary work going. You may get your share of it, but you have got to begin by shoving some incompetent fellow out. And in order to be able to begin, you must learn the trade. How did you begin? Just in that way. While you were roaming about London like a fine gentleman, I began by earning 24 shillings a week. Can I earn 24 shillings a week? You won't, because you already got your fellowship. You had a knack for writing Greek iambics, and therefore got a fellowship. I picked up at the same time the way of stringing English together. I also learned the way to be hungry. I'm not hungry now very often, but I've been through it. My belief is that you wouldn't get along with my editor. That's your idea of being independent? Certainly it is. I do his work and take his pay and obey his orders. There's not room here, but there is no doubt room elsewhere. There's a trade to be learned like any other trade, but my belief is that even then you could not do it. We don't want Greek iambics. I'm going to try not to crow all through this part of the chapter. Harry turned away disgusted. Quaverdale was like the rest of the world, and thought that a peculiar talent and a peculiar tact were needed for his own business. Harry believed that he was able to write a leading article at any rate as Quaverdale, and that Greek iambics would not stand in his way. But he conceived it to be probable that his habits of cleanliness might do so, and gave up the idea for the present. Yeah, he's too good for freelance work. His habits of cleanliness get in the way. He couldn't do an article on the fly that's readable and clean in an hour for his 20 shillings. No, he couldn't do that. Well, I mean, he easily could do that, of course, because he studied Greek iambics at school. No, it's that he's too well tailored. He thought that his friend should have welcomed him with an open hand into the realms of literature, and perhaps it was the case Quaverdale attributed too much weight to the knack of turning readable paragraphs on any subjects at a moment's notice. I don't think he put too much weight on that, Spanky, and I don't think you could do it. But what should he do down at Buston? There were 3 persons there with whom he had to contend: his father, his mother, and his uncle. With his father he had always been on good terms, but had been subject to a certain amount of gentle sarcasm. He had got his fellowship and his allowance, and had so been lifted above his father's authority. His father thoroughly despised his brother-in-law, and looked down upon him as an absolute ass. But he was reticent, only dropping a word here and there out of deference, perhaps to his wife, and from a feeling lest his son might be deficient in wise courtesy if he were encouraged to laugh at his benefactor. He had said a word or two as to a profession when Harry left Cambridge. But the word or two had come to nothing. In those days the uncle had altogether ridiculed the idea, and the mother, fond of her son, the fellow and heir, had altogether opposed the notion. Why should he have a profession if he's getting an income? The rector himself was an idle, good-looking, self-indulgent man, a man who read a little and understood what he read, and thought a little and understood what he thought, but who took no trouble about anything. To go through the world comfortably with a rather large family and a rather small income was the extent of his ambition. In regard to his eldest son, he had begun well. Harry had been educated free and had got a fellowship. He had never cost his father a shilling. And now the eldest of two grown-up daughters was engaged to be married to the son of a brewer living in a little town of Buntingford. This also was a piece of good luck, which the rector accepted with a thankful heart. There was another grown-up girl, also pretty, and then a third girl, not grown-up, and the two boys, who were at present at school at Royston. Thus burdened, the Reverend Mr. Annesley went through the world with as jaunty a step as possible, making but little of his troubles, but anxious to make as much as he could of his advantages. Of these, the position of Harry was the brightest, if only Harry would be careful to guard it. It was quite out of the question that he should find an income for Harry if the squire stopped the £250 per annum which he at present allowed him. That last point is important. Mr. Annesley cannot possibly pay that allowance himself. If Harry loses that from his uncle, he loses it. He's just out that money. Then there was Harry's mother, who had already very frequently discounted the good things which were to fall to Harry's lot. She was a dear, good, motherly woman, all of whose geese were certainly counted to be swans. And of all the swans, Harry was the whitest, whereas in purity of plumage, Mary, the eldest daughter, who had won the affections of the young Buntingford brewer, was the next. That Harry's allowance should be stopped would be almost as great a misfortune as though Mr. Thoroughbung were to break his neck out hunting with the Parkeridge hounds, an amusement which, after the manner of brewers, he was much in the habit of following. In other words, her daughter's prospective husband, prosperous brewer, his death would be just about as bad as Harry losing his allowance. And also, I know a couple of you had your ears perk up there. That it was indeed the mention of a foxhound. So are we going to see the Parkeridge hounds in action? Let's wait and see. Mrs. Annesley had lived in Boston all her life, having been born at the Hall. She was an excellent mother of a family and a good clergyman's wife, being in both respects most painstaking and assiduous than her husband. More painstaking and assiduous than her husband. She keeps the books, in other words, and keeps food on the table. But she did maintain something of the respect for her brother, though in her inmost heart she knew that he was a fool. But to have been born Squire of Buston was something, and to have reached the age of 50 unmarried, so as to leave the position of heir open to her son, was more. To such a one a great deal was due, but of that deal Harry was but little disposed to pay any part. He must be talked to, and very seriously talked to, and if possible saved from the sin of offending his easily offended uncle. A terrible idea had been suggested to her lately by her husband. The entail might be made altogether inoperative by the marriage of her brother. Uncle Prosper might marry and have a son of his own. It was a fearful notion, but one which, if entered into her brother's head, might possibly be carried out. No one before her had ever dreamed of anything so dangerous to the Annesley interests, and Mr. Annesley now felt that by due submission on the part of the heir it might be avoided. But for the squire himself was the foe whom Harry most feared. He certainly sounds it by this point, right? Harry's father, and Harry's mother, the squire's own sister, all think the man's an idiot. He quite understood that he would be required to be submissive, and even if he were willing, he did not know how to act the part. There was much now that he would endure for the sake of Florence. If Mr. Prosper demanded that after dinner he should sit and hear a sermon, he would sit and hear it out. If it would be a bore, but might be endured on behalf of the girl whom he loved. Keep in mind, we've been told that typically when Uncle Prosper gives a sermon after supper, Harry says that he's due over at the parsonage, even though Uncle Prosper has learned, to his anger, that Harry doesn't go. He just uses that as an excuse. He doesn't actually go. But he much feared that the cause of his uncle's displeasure was deeper than that. Yes, indeed. A rumor had reached him that his uncle had declared his conduct to Montjoy Scarborough to have been abominable. He had heard no word spoken by his uncle, but threats had reached him through his mother, and also through his uncle's man of business. He certainly would go down to Buston and carry himself towards his uncle with what outward sign of respect would be possible. But if his uncle accused him, he could not but tell his uncle that he knew nothing of the matter of which he was talking. Not for all Buston would he admit that he had done anything mean or ignoble. Florence, he was quite sure, would not desire it. Florence would not be Florence were she too desire it. He thought that he could trace the hands, or rather the tongues, through which the calumny had made its way down to the hall. He would at once go to the hall and tell his uncle all the facts. He would describe the gross ill-usage to which he had been subjected. No doubt he had left the man sprawling upon the pavement, but there had been no sign that the man had been dangerously hurt. And when 2 days afterward the man had vanished, it was clear that he could not have vanished without legs. Had he taken himself off, as was probable, then why need Harry trouble himself as to his vanishing? And if someone else had helped him in escaping, as was also probable, why had not that someone come forward and told the circumstances when all the inquiries were being made? Why should he have been expected to speak the circumstances of such an encounter, which could not have been told but to Captain Scarborough's infinite disgrace? And he could not have told it without naming Florence Montjoy. His uncle, when he heard the truth, must acknowledge that he had not behaved badly. And yet Harry, as he turned it all in his mind, was uneasy as to his own conduct. Yeah, because you're lying. Of course you behaved badly. But he could not quite acquit himself in that he had kept a secret of all the facts of that midnight encounter in the face of inquiries which had been made, and that in that he had falsely assured Augustus Scarborough of his ignorance. Remember that earlier chapter where in a dinner with Augustus Scarborough, he tells a flat-out lie about the last time he saw Montjoy Scarborough. It doesn't really matter in the large, us, from our vantage point. We have the catbird seat here. We know everything. And from our vantage point, we can say that it doesn't really matter because Augustus has been lying his face off about Montjoy the whole time anyway. But still, it matters to the world and to the police and probably to Uncle Prosper. And yet he knew that on no consideration would he acknowledge himself to have been wrong. That's not good. That's how the chapter ends. And I think we can agree that my I'll finish this later bookmark is getting in the way. There's a stuffed mouse. I used to have stuffed and contented mice in this apartment. I don't anymore. They're all gone. I miss them, but maybe they'll be back. But I think we can see that is a recipe for disaster, that chapter that we read. Because Harry has now heard rumors that all is not well with his uncle. Uncle Prosper has been to Harry's father, threatening to cut off his allowance, threatening to end the entail so that Harry does not inherit Buston. Threatening to ruin Harry, in other words, because Harry has not been raised in a profession. He's been told that he will inherit. Harry thinks he knows where those rumors come from, and he thinks he knows why his uncle is so angry, because his uncle probably believes the worst possible story about what happened between him and Montjoy Scarborough. Okay, but if you think your uncle believes that, you have to go down there and make peace. And Harry, at the end of this chapter, Harry's spoiling for a fight. This is not going to end well. It doesn't look like it's going to end well. And then there's that whole idea of Uncle Prosper marrying. What could that be about? I promised you, months ago or weeks ago, I promised you 2 characters at least coming in the book that you are going to like and love. I said they were both women. Florence Montjoy doesn't count. Lady Montjoy in Brussels certainly does not count. And Florence Montjoy's mother, Mrs. Montjoy, Mama Montjoy, does not count. We've already seen one of them. We've already seen Mr. Grey's daughter. There's one other. but let's not jump the gun. Anyway, so that is our next chapter, Mr. Scarborough's Family. We'll wrap this up now, and we'll just keep barreling along. So I'll see you next time. Thank you, BookTube.